I'd like to welcome you to our BIRA Education Effectiveness and Improvement Special Interest Group event today. It's called Has Quality Killed Teaching? And I'm delighted to be joined by my co-convener, Vicky Bamsey. Vicky's going to give you a little wave.
Hi everyone, lovely to meet you all.
And by a fantastic group of professors from Australia and from the UK. I have Jo Lampert. Do you want to give us a little wave, Jo? Larissa McLean-Davis. I think Larissa is with us and will be back very shortly. Hi, Larissa. Amy McPherson. Claire Brooks. And Ben Hutsey. And together we've been looking at issues relating to teacher recruitment and retention in Australia and in the UK under a banner of the International Teacher Workforce Collaboration, which you'll hear a lot more about very soon. But for today, we wanted to raise the profile of issues that impact on teacher recruitment and retention. And in one of our discussions, we were talking about the role that quality plays in that. So today, we're going to be discussing this as a panel, but also through our positions in relation to has quality killed teaching. And so to kick us off today, I'd like to invite Claire Brooks to put her position forward.
Thanks very much, Tanya. Hello, everyone. As Tanya says, my name is Claire Brooks. I'm a professor of education at the University of Cambridge, and my particular focus has always been in teacher education. And I spent some time working at the IOE in London, where I did quite a lot of work around the idea of teacher education, and particularly the notion of quality at scale. If you've got this thing called quality, can you really have it at a large scale? And through doing that, I became really obsessed with this idea, this word quality, and the different ways in which we use it, the way it becomes a weasel word that we try to use to convince people to do things the way that we want to do them, and how the way that we define quality really influences our practices and what we prioritize in what we do. So within that work, I started to categorize different definitions of the ways in which quality gets used. So to give you some examples, we often might talk about quality as being a range of input measures. So the quality of the people that come onto the course as indicating the quality of the course itself. Or we might talk about, for instance, output measures. So what people leave the course with, the attainment that they get, whether they're able to get a job afterwards, those kinds of things. And we also might talk about perspectival measures, so what people think about the course, how they evaluate it, and also processes, so what the curriculum might look like, for instance. But none of these measures that we use, I would argue, actually talk about quality, the quality of the education experience itself. They're all just proxies for quality. So, for instance, if you focus on input measures and you say, for example, a good graduate will make a good teacher, then what you're saying is that quality can't be widely achieved, and what actually happens on the course doesn't really make a difference. Similarly, output measures, if you're saying the number of people that get a job is an indicator of a good quality course, that means nothing when you've got a situation of massive teacher shortages. We know perspectival data is highly subjective, and we also know that the quality of a curriculum doesn't necessarily translate into the quality of a learning experience. So these are all proxies for quality. And drawing on the work of Lee Harvey, he argues that many of these things are orientated around standards. So they might be teacher standards, academic standards, service standards, or they're about quality assurance. So they're focused on things like, is something value for money? Is it fitness for purpose? But these are all things that are tied up with accountability, not quality. And so what these measures do is they don't tell us anything about the quality of the learning experience itself, the quality of the education that takes place, how it facilitates transformation that we need quality to occur. And I would argue that's where quality really lies. But of course, that kind of quality is incredibly hard to measure. Policies, schools, the accountability industry, they've all focused on things that we can measure, inputs, outputs, perspectives. And what that does is that forces our attention onto these peripheral concerns. Who gets onto programs, who graduates the programs, what they get at the end of it. But what they don't do is make us talk about the quality of teaching that takes place. The discourse around quality doesn't enhance teaching, and it certainly doesn't make teaching an attractive profession. In fact, it's probably doing its best to kill teaching off. And just to be clear, I don't mean here that individuals have stopped talking about teaching or having important conversations about why teaching matters. In fact, some of the research that I'm involved with at the moment says the exact opposite, that people are really talking about those things. But the point I'm making is that an explicit concern about quality defined through specific measures or indicators, or that focuses on a narrow conception of evidence-based research or a narrow conception of what the curriculum is, too narrowly focuses us into peripheral concerns and shuts down conversations about the very things that are not easily measured, but which really make up the importance of what makes teaching and education a transformative experience. So for me, quality has almost killed teaching when quality is seen solely in relation to accountability and narrow conceptions of teaching. That's me, Tanya.
Claire, thank you. What a fantastic start to our discussion. And I love the concept of quality as a weasel word. Having written about quality in relation to teacher recruitment and retention, particularly in education isolated areas, I couldn't agree more. And this idea of quality as a proxy notion, or the measurement of quality in proxy terms, is really important to conceptualize. So thank you very much for that, Claire. So let's move over to Australia and to Melbourne and to see what Joe Lampert has to add to the discussion. Hi, Joe.
Hi, thanks, Tanya. Thanks, Claire, and lovely to meet everyone. Thank you for inviting me. In Australia, we would always begin with an acknowledgement of the traditional owners of the land. So I'm going to do that today and say that I am on Wurundjeri country, on the unceded lands of the Kulin people in Australia. And I think that is significant to this conversation. So I'll just tell you who I am. I'm a professor of teacher education for social transformation at Monash University. I co-lead Monash's Education Workforce for the Future Impact Lab, and I also lead our social justice teacher education faculty research and scholarship group. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about myself and then maybe throw in 3 thoughts or provocations at the end of that. So just so that everybody in this room knows who I am, I led very large social justice teacher education programs for 15 plus-ish years. 2 large programs, one which was kind of a mainstream social justice teacher education program, and another that it is still, although I don't run it, an employment-based pathway into teaching. I don't run either of those programs anymore. I would argue that the quality agenda has had quite a large impact on both of those. And one of the things I would say, first of all, about teacher education is that we run into issues now of quality versus quantity, where we talk about quality teacher education, but really the thing that's obsessing us is just quantity. How many bums can we get on seats, if you want to say it that way, because we also have a dire teaching shortage. Since then, though, I made that kind of move into other issues around hard to staff schools. So out of teacher education in a way, and on to researching teacher shortages. Amy and I are working together on a project about teacher retention, what's happening to the teachers who remain in the hardest to staff schools. So there are other issues around quality. Quality agenda is very high in all schools. And I'd like to propose that one of the things we could talk about today is the issue of quality in respect to equality or inequality, because quality, I think, the whole quality agenda has a different impact on, private schools, wealthy schools, or what in Australia we would call leafy green schools, than it does on schools in disadvantaged areas. So that's the second thing I would say. And the third thing that I would throw in is that I've also for many, many years worked in Indigenous education. And I think that is relevant to this conversation because Claire is talking about quality as a weasel term. I'd written down, to talk about quality as a slippery term. And my Indigenous colleague, Marnie Shea, and I have written on community according to whom, and I would say that this is relevant here too. Quality according to whom? Who decides what this word quality means and the evidence that we're going to use to prove that we are doing something of quality? So I think those are my beginning statements.
Thank you so much, Jo. And again, it's that dichotomy, isn't it? I mean, Claire mentioned how we've got to see around the periphery and the complex issues that we have in understanding quality in relation to teaching. And you talked about quantity versus quality. We have the same issue in England and the 4 nations of the UK in terms of teacher shortages that you have in Australia. And this idea of getting more in, my concern around this is the status of teaching. What happens if you build it high without having that, inverted commas, quality underneath? And what happens, as you say, to equality and the opportunity of those to get teaching in our most disadvantaged areas or under-resourced, as I'm hearing it called now, as we're redefining that term of what disadvantage actually means. So thank you, Jo. Really interesting ideas for our discussion there. Quantity versus quality and quality versus equality. We're going to stay in Australia, and I'm going to ask Larissa McLean-Davies now to share her thoughts on Has Quality Killed Teaching with us.
Hello everyone, I'm Larissa McLean-Davies. I'm from the University of Melbourne in Australia. I'm Professor of Teacher Education and currently Deputy Dean. In my past, I've had the remit for working with pre-service teachers and running the course around pre-service teacher education. We had a program called a clinical teaching model, which was really trying to drive what we perceived as an important, I guess, quality approach. And I say that because when we think about quality teaching and who's driving it, of course, the question is who's actually determining what is quality, and is it the profession? Is it outside the profession? Is it policy? And of course it is. So quality has been such a word, and it was great to hear Claire talk that it's slippery, and it's sometimes one of those words that you don't want to claim because in fact it's been used in such a way to mean other things. So the work that we have been doing and that I have been doing is really to think about how is issues of teacher retention and recruitment part of quality. And in my historical research in this country, I've been looking at the ways in which policy documents from the 1980s and 1990s have for a long time put these two issues of retention and quality together. But interestingly, earlier policy documents were sharing them in such a way as it was a teacher shortage, teachers who weren't prepared, who were teaching out of field, who were teaching in places where they weren't supported, that was impacting on the quality of teaching that students were receiving. So what has actually happened as we've moved over time is that notion of being in service and not being supported and not being able to be teaching in the way that you might be wanting to teach or have been prepared to teach, and you're teaching in very complex circumstances, has been disaggregated, certainly in this country. And quality is seen as something that is particularly and primarily in policy documents in the pre-service teaching space. And it's something that is the responsibility of universities and pre-service providers. So the slipperiness of quality and the slipperiness of retention have shifted over time in our neoliberal environment. So this is a really interesting thing for us to think about. I often think when I'm questioning myself, has quality killed teaching? What other professions would we say, how would we say quality teaching? If we were thinking of a quality healthcare system, we would never think of it at the individual doctor level. something that contributes to that. But of course, the system is much wider, and quality healthcare we understand to be rich, diverse. But we know from our research, of course, and our research with policy, that teaching is often seen at the individual teacher level. We'll talk a little bit more about how that comes into the pre-service, or that comes into in-service and schools and regulations and accountability shortly. But it's an interesting thing for us to think about. Where is the quality teaching agenda sitting with the individual pre-service teacher, with the pre-service teacher education program, and then not so much with the system itself? So if quality is killing teaching, then what part of it is being killed by it? I would ask. It's teachers as they come into the profession. It's certainly our understanding and our work with the pre-service teacher education providers. And I guess the last point then to really think about that is, we know that none of us would want to say we don't want quality and expert teachers, but there's part of us needing to reclaim, I guess, that quality agenda. And I know my colleagues here are doing that with their work in thinking about those words and how they come together. So quality teaching, has it killed it? There's probably a lot of other things that are killing teaching at the same time at the moment, and that is the sort of expectations of that quality. But for us now, I think we need to reclaim that word and really think about how we might think of it more as a system rather than the individual or the pre-service phase.
Thank you, Larissa. Yeah, I was really thinking about that as you were putting that position forward. That clinical model of understanding quality across teaching rather than quality as an individual teacher trait, I think is really important to differentiate. And I was thinking, is there something clever I can say around quality being a symptom of the disease, but actually just one of those elements of it that impact? And I'm sure we will unpick this more as we go through our discussion today. So thank you, Larissa. Really interesting thoughts there. We're going to stay in Australia for Amy. So Amy, would you like to position whether quality has killed teaching for you?
Sure, thanks, Tanya. Thank you for inviting me. I think what I've got to say might dovetail really nicely with what Larissa just talked about. So my name is Amy McPherson. I'm a senior lecturer at the School of Education in the University of Newcastle. I also work as a researcher in the Teachers and Teaching Research Centre there. I currently co-lead an Australian Research Council grant on teacher shortages in Australia, essentially. The grant's titled The Impact of Teacher Shortages on Teachers Remaining in Hard-to-Staff Schools. And I guess the focus of this project is it's ethnographic, so it's really trying to investigate the lived experiences of teachers who remain in our hardest-to-staff schools at a time of unprecedented teacher shortages. So in reflecting on this question of did quality kill teaching for me, I think it's asking us and trying to bring together what we've been talking about, this overemphasis on these rigid definitions of teacher quality and the unintended negative consequences of that, whether it's, this pursuit of measurable outcomes in standardized testing, whether it's rigid curriculum standards, whether it's teacher performance metrics in ITE or in teaching, has made teaching, less flexible, more stressful, less effective, less appealing, thereby contributing to the current challenges that we're facing with recruitment and retention. In the work that I do, I draw heavily on an occupational status perspective that Richard Ingersoll has kind of advanced for some time. And I really like this way of thinking about teacher quality because it moves it away from a focus on this individual teacher deficit model, and it highlights the need for these, the question of quality be located within broader systemic issues. So what's a quality teaching learning environment look like, So framed in this way, that the research that I'm involved in really tries to examine the extraordinary efforts that teachers are going to at the moment to keep schools functioning in what can only be described as really a crisis situation. And I'm going to be a little bit different, than the crisis. I don't think is solely driven by a relentless focus on quality, but by a range of really complex factors, including the chronic underfunding of public education in Australia, the marketisation of education, and the residualisation then of poverty in public education. I think the increased public scrutiny of teachers and teachers' work, the privatisation of education as well. I think overwork, declining wellbeing amongst students and teachers. I think underserved communities as well, and the access to community infrastructure is even playing a part. You know, we've heard some reports around the way childcare plays out in different spaces for teaching challenges. And, you know, more recently, there's been great work done by Scott Ecott at the University of New South Wales, looking at how housing instability and housing unaffordability in some of our big metropolitan cities has impacted teacher recruitment and retention in those spaces. So I guess while teacher shortages across the system in Australia might be reasonably new, we've had long-standing problems with teacher recruitment and retention in rural and remote schools, in urban underserved schools, and schools serving communities, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. So I think there's, lots of complex things going on. I think the question for us about teacher quality is really then set against this backdrop of where infrastructure and the support for schools or for teachers has been severely weakened, even to the point where I think it's arguably breaking down completely. In some of the hardest to staff schools that we've been doing our work in, we see teacher shortages sort of creating these incredibly, adding to high intensity working environments. So they're exacerbating these existing challenges with teacher recruitment and retention. Schools are facing a crisis in retention the same way they're trying to manage a crisis, in recruitment. So they've got these dual focuses, going on concurrently. Schools have adapted their their organisational practices and structures to try and accommodate teacher shortages. And in doing so, they've that's added to teachers' working loads. It's normalising out of field teaching in these spaces. It reduces non-instructional teaching time, even to the point of a greater utilisation of paraprofessional staff to take on, non-core teaching roles. So each of these schools are managing these in slightly different ways, but it all hides the full extent of the shortages and thereby the crisis in the actual system. This level of crisis, I guess, leads to this cycle of instability where you've got teachers burning out, you've got unstable relationships between students and teachers. That sort of fuels this cycle, I guess, of job dissatisfaction. A good example, I guess, a simple one, is around how induction processes work in some of these schools. So we argue for induction to be a policy approach that supports early career teacher retention. But if you've got a school with high turnover, you've got only a minimal amount of experienced teachers in that space, high levels of new teachers coming in, we've got limited capacity to deliver induction programs, and it's stress it consistently plays out for more experienced teachers. So that kind of just that little policy cycle there breaks down completely in these contexts. So I think, talking about many of these issues, I think we need to recognise that there's a whole bunch of systemic issues that really need to be addressed that include, the preservation of non-teaching time for teachers, dealing with out-of-field teaching, how we manage workloads in this space, how we manage induction. And so these considerations for me really, I guess, challenge me to consider whether quality teaching is even possible without the typical support structures in place, and that teachers' efforts alone can't offset this broader systemic crisis for me.
Amy, thank you. I mean, there's so much in there that I think we can relate to in the UK as well as what's been happening in Australia. And it kind of begs the question whether we should refine our panel discussion from has quality killed teaching to is quality possible in teaching, which completely refocuses it, doesn't it, from a quality and accountability issue to a systems driven issue. And where you started with this idea of rigid definitions and as Larissa said, what is driving quality right at the beginning. And I know that Beng Hutt has been doing lots of research in this area internationally, but based in the UK. So Beng Hutt, if you'd like to give us your provocation really, or position in relation to has quality killed teaching. Thank you, Amy.
Yeah, hi. My name is Beng Hutt. I'm Professor of Education Research at the University of Birmingham. I was previously from Durham University, just recently started my work at Birmingham. As my title suggests, I do mainly research, probably because I can't teach. I think what I'm going to say chimes a lot with what the other presenters have already spoken. Shall I go on to my 5 minute, or you want me to just address this? Yeah. Okay. So what as Tanya has mentioned, I've done a lot of research into looking into teacher recruitment and retention in how to staff schools, and also we are now focusing at looking at international education policies and comparing countries across OECD countries to see why some countries have oversupply and they don't report a shortage of teachers, and why some countries have a chronic shortage of teachers for decades. And we try to look at the characteristics of these countries to see whether there's anything, there are any commonalities among these countries that don't have a shortage of teachers. Is it cultural? Is it respect? Is it value for teachers? Or or is it because of the way they train teachers, the teacher education system works, the way they recruit teachers? Is it the quality of teachers they recruit? Maybe they don't look at the quality. Maybe they don't look at, they just look at the minimum criteria needed for, admissions to teacher training. So, and then when I look at the what we have in England, when we analyze the school workforce data and the UCAS data, we found that about 30% of people who apply to teacher training are rejected across, over 10 years. Consistently, about 30% of applicants who apply to teacher training have been rejected. So on what grounds are these people rejected? Is it on quality? Did they not meet the criteria? Many of them may have quite good A-level grades, and yet they are rejected. So we question what do teacher training providers look for? What kind of quality? How do we define quality? Is it it's not just A-level grades. It's not just university degree classification. Some of them have got honors degree 2, 1, or first, and yet they are rejected from some institutions. So it's quite nebulous. It's quite a black art. We don't really understand what criteria institutions use to recruit teachers, and we still do not know. So we look at this international data, and we found that countries that do not we use a method called qualitative comparative analysis, comparing the characteristics across different variables, looking at the the economic situation of the country, looking at the employment rates of graduates, and the pay of teachers compared to other profession, and the relative and the working hours, the workload, etc. So about 38 variables we have, and then we've narrowed down to about probably 10 variables, and then we found that what these countries that do not have a shortage of teachers have in common is that the factors that determine whether a country would have a shortage or not are a combination of the employment rate of social science and humanities graduates. If the employment rates of humanities and social science graduates are high, then we are less likely to get teachers into teacher training, and therefore we have a shortage of teachers. And then we also look at the another factor is the rate of teachers reporting abuse by students. That is another important factor. Countries that report a high rate of abuse by teachers by students tend to have a shortage of teachers, suggesting that the working environment is one factor. Right. So, and then we look at also the population. We found that, interestingly, population in countries where most of the schools are located in towns, you are more likely to have a shortage. Whereas in countries where you have large cities, where most of the schools are located in large cities or small villages, you tend to have a shortage of teachers. Some of these can be manipulated by policy. Some of these are beyond our control, right? So we have to look at all these factors and see what we can control and what we can't. So going back to selection of teachers into teacher training, how do we know who makes a good teacher? How do we define quality? Right? Intuitively, we all think that we know what an effective teacher looks like, and then but there's so far research has suggested that there's little consensus on how best we can measure or capture the essence of a good teacher. Typically, there are three ways of evaluating the effectiveness of a teacher. We ask the pupils, right, perceptions of a teacher. We ask parents or inspectors, to observe the teacher, and then they give a rating. Or we use, very commonly we use pupil attainment scores. So what happens in this instance is that if you use pupil attainment scores, what is likely to happen is that you tend to equate teachers who consistently get high pupil attainment, and then you rate these teachers as effective because they produce effective learners. But then that is not an accurate way or a fair way of judging, because if you happen to be a teacher teaching in a high-performing school with a high-performing group of students, then you consistently get good grades. And then what researchers tend to do is to look at characteristics of these teachers. What do they have? And then they conclude that, okay, these teachers have these characteristics. Therefore, the characteristic of an effective teacher are these, have these characteristics. Right, it's like you going to a school and you see that all effective schools have a potted plant, and therefore you conclude that having a potted plant makes an effective school. So that is a kind of analogy that people use in defining what an effective teacher is. But that is we know that is not a fair way of judging an effective teacher. And it's like somebody mentioned just now, I think Larissa mentioned health service. If we measure the effectiveness of a doctor by the number of patients they treat and the number of patients who die, then if you have a group of patients who are very ill, you're more likely to have high rates of death among your patients. Can we suggest that these doctors are not effective? So if you're unlucky, you have a group of pupils who are very low performing in very poor schools in challenging conditions, and then you will be defined as poor teacher or ineffective teacher. And increasingly, people are using value-added measures, thinking that value-added measures might be a fair way of judging an effective teacher. So you look at the progress of the pupils that you have from the prior attainment scores and how much progress they make in later on in their years of education. Progress 8 in England, for example, is an example. But then what we found in our research is that pupil gain scores are not a good way of measuring teacher effectiveness because they're subject to error propagation due to missing data. Schools, for example, with a lot of missing prior test scores for their pupils tend to have higher progress 8 scores than schools with complete or more complete data. So it makes us suspicious as to what are we measuring. Right, and also we found that value-added scores vary considerably from year to year, so we cannot predict what the progress 8 scores will be like in a few years' time. And when we asked the school leaders, the principals, to predict what their school progress 8 scores would be like, and we found that it was very, very inaccurate. So it's not a good measure of the characteristic of school. And yet we are still using these progress 8 scores, these effectiveness scores, to rate teachers and schools. And I think schools are punished and even shamed based on these inaccurate measures. And another study, this is a study that my PhD student did with
Beng Huk, could I stop you there? Is that okay? Because I think actually that point that you made about the way in which schools are measured leads us quite nicely into one of the first questions for the panel discussion. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Fantastic. So, you're absolutely right. I love the fact that you refer to quality and the way in which the quality of the teacher is a black art, that black art of measuring effectiveness. And it reminds me of what Claire said right at the beginning of these position statements, which was, what is quality? What does it actually mean? Is it individual? Is it systems-led? Is it outcomes-led? Is it attainment-led? Is it perspective-led? Is it process-led? What is quality? Because how can we say whether quality has killed teaching if we don't actually know how we're defining quality in the first place? And I think all of your positioning statements demonstrate the nebulous notion of what quality actually is. Is it about teacher effectiveness? Is it about systems effectiveness? It quite clearly doesn't appear to be that way, because actually, you know, as Larissa said, you wouldn't judge a health system by one doctor within it, but one teacher's quality might be perceived, as you said, Bernhard, within the accountability measures for the whole school. So let's go on to that. Let's look at accountability measures and the impact of those, whether that's for the teacher, for the school, for the system, for the country. And so actually, I'd quite like to call on Claire, first of all, actually, to see whether you've got any comments to make about the impact of accountability measures and the way in which this high stakes inspection system that we have in England specifically, but actually exists in other countries internationally, has an impact on teacher morale, job satisfaction and retention rates.
Thanks, Tanya. I mean, what an interesting discussion. So to the question, the impact. I mean, I live in a country with Ofsted, okay, and anybody who's been reading the news in the last couple of years cannot fail to be aware of the national debate around Ofsted and its fitness for purpose as an inspectorate, and as a way of a key role it has within our education system. And I think when we've heard all of the things that have happened around Ofsted, even acknowledged by Ofsted itself, we've got to say that, you know, the consequences of such a high stakes inspection system has a really detrimental effect on teacher morale, job satisfaction and potentially retention. And research has told us this time and time again. And I'm thinking specifically of the work of Jane Perriman with the Beyond Ofsted report, but also the work that Jane did with Graham Calvert, looking at what teachers said that their intentions were and why they were thinking of leaving, if they were thinking of leaving. And what that research tells us over and over again is that teachers expect to work hard, teachers expect their job to be tough, they expect to be held accountable for certain things. But what really, really grinds them down is when the accountability regime and how it's interpreted by schools or other institutions, how that makes their work change and stops them from thinking about the things that matter, working with students, and they find themselves doing unnecessary, you know, and bureaucratic kinds of things. And that makes me ask, if you're a bright young thing today who wants to change the world, who wants to do something really important in society, why would you go into teaching? And I'm not saying that because I devalue the teaching profession. I think, you know, I loved being a teacher, and teaching is a wonderful job to do, but it's become quite a toxic profession to be in. And I think when we've got to that situation, and I really hope the pendulum is starting to swing the other way, we've got to ask ourselves, what is accountability for, and who is accountability for, and in whose interests is it serving? And is it really serving the needs of our children and of our schools and our society? And if it isn't, then it really has to change. And we have to ask ourselves, what's the purpose of having a high stakes accountability system?
That's such a good question, Claire. I mean, what is the point of it? And actually in Australia, and I'm thinking, Larissa, you might have some comments on this. In Australia, they don't have the same, or you don't have the same accountability, high stakes accountability system for your schools, but there is an accountability system that's quite data driven that exists pre-entry into teaching. And I think it might be quite useful for our audience to hear about that.
Certainly. Yeah, so we haven't, or we did have an Ofsted kind of experience in Australia, but it was many decades ago. There was the school inspectorate, and there was, but very different times. So there hasn't been that same accountability system, but it doesn't mean that teachers are not feeling accountable as they are being measured. So one of the things that I think is, and I know that Amy will probably jump in and have some more to say about this as well, but I think that the way in which accountability of teaching and learning is measured in a sort of ersatz substitute way, of course, is in the regular high stakes testing that we have of students. And so the publication of data around high stakes, the way in which that's collated over time, the way in which it's made public and available, and schools are ranked against one another, is a clear way of the kind of accountability measures of teaching being put in that way. So that kind of big data that we have, and this is interesting because it's where the sort of substitute measure or the inferential measure of quality teaching is taking place. And interesting that it happens on the broad scale then at the sort of school level when we're in that kind of situation. So we certainly have the gathering together of teachers as they prepare and come into the profession, and that kind of accountability measure, the notion of being ready to teach, and that is a really significant part. We could talk for a long time as if one can ever be ready to teach, but the accountability and the gathering of data, big data in final assessments. But interestingly, we do not have that same kind of Ofsted in the pre-service, then coming into the external, into the in-service environment. Amy, did you want to talk about datification a bit more?
No, I think that, given the time constraints, Larissa, I think that's a fantastic capturing of really the differences between the two systems. Yeah.
I'm interested actually in whether you feel that this is a positive step forward as well, because one of the things we wanted to discuss was whether there were alternative approaches to quality assurance, and I'll put that in inverted commas as well, that could prioritise teacher wellbeing and professional development, and really do what Claire has said that we need, which is re-establish teaching as a graduate career of choice. Because at the moment, I think you used the word toxic, Claire, it's a toxic environment. Why would you want to go into teaching? And we're all advocates of the teaching profession. We see the privilege that teaching is, but at the same time, how challenging it is in the current circumstances in both of our countries. So actually, in Australia, do you think the removal of an Ofsted type systems-led inspection framework is a positive move? I'm looking at Jo actually, because Jo was nodding there. I don't know if Jo's got a comment
I
there.
don't know that I was nodding at that as much as I was wanting to jump in on the conversation in general in some ways to say, I think there are a lot of elephants in the room in these conversations. Because in the work Amy and I are engaged in, and I spend a lot of time in schools, there is talk of quality. And in some ways, one of the things we're finding is that there are kind of two kinds of school leaders. There are the principals who protect their teachers from some of these quality measures. They will report back to the departments of education, and they will make sure that they collect the data, but they're there almost as a human shield, and they protect their teachers from some of this stuff because they know that in reality, and of course, I only spend time in the hardest to staff, most disadvantaged schools. So I don't really know what's going on in the private schools, to be honest. But in reality, teachers are lurching from crisis to crisis. They really are. Like they really have very little time to do what we would historically have called quality teaching historically in old-fashioned traditional senses. So teachers are lurching from crisis to crisis. Some principals are protecting them. In other schools, principals have gone whole hog down that datification road and are trying to make their schools high-performing schools. I think Ben Watt used that term. So some of the low SES schools also trying to, rebrand their schools as high-performing, going straight down that road. But there are so many elephants in the room here. Ben Watt also talked about how our teachers selected to come into ITE programs. Well, in Australia, to be really honest, there is so much pressure on ITE to boost their numbers that I have to say, in all honesty, we're letting just about anybody into teaching at the moment. And that is not meant to slam or criticize teachers who really have a terrible moral internal dilemmas around wanting to be good people who care about kids. But that's not what seems to matter to them and for them anymore. So, for instance, we have a big, we've got this complicated system in Australia whereby the federal government, the Department of Education fund like curriculum, but the states are responsible for schools and staffing, in fact. But there's this big high achieving teacher funding program, Commonwealth federal money at the moment, and they've just poured $10 million plus into getting more teachers into schools. And that has really pressured most universities. I don't know, Larissa, if you would agree with this, but pretty much every ITE program feels pressured to bring more students in. So the pre-COVID, if we want to see that is a kind of a defining moment, measures on how we would attract quality teachers into the profession. Those conversations are almost gone now, to be honest. It's like, can we get some more in, and can we place them, and can we give them early permission to teach or provisional status? And at the same time, how can we continue talking about, we want to be more like Finland, we want to be this high quality teaching profession. But the truth of the matter is that's very hard to do if we're going to put them in schools as teachers in front of classrooms before they've even taken our courses. So I think there are some elephants in the room.
And I think you're absolutely right to raise those points, Jo. And I know Ben Hutt's going to have some comments on this, and there are lots of comments around this in the chat as well. And I think the fact that when Ben Hutt said 30% of teachers are unsuccessful in their application, trainee teachers are unsuccessful in their applications to become trainee teachers, that's really triggered a discussion in the chat. So Ben Hutt, I'm sure you've got a position on this.
Yeah, what I was going to say is that, we do not know how teacher training providers or institutions, how do they select, or how do they judge, or how do they, decide what a good teacher looks like? Because a lot of them would say, okay, they go through the interview panel, and then the interview panel say, oh yeah, I'm sure this person, will make a very good teacher because they demonstrate that they could teach, and sometimes they are asked to do a demonstration lesson. So before even they have gone through the teaching, they are expected to be able to teach. And so if you can't demonstrate that you have got experience in teaching, or you can't demonstrate that you are able to teach, then you're not selected, no matter how good you are, in your qualifications. So that's something that we need to consider. I think in countries, I'm not sure I'm right, but I think in Finland and countries like that, where there's a minimum set of criteria that applicants have to meet, and if they have met those criteria, they will automatically be entered for training. So maybe we should set a minimum criteria that is required, and then we have to adhere to those criteria instead of making subjective judgments, because that's what training is for. Training is to make people who are not particularly very good in teaching to be a better teacher, right? So you may be a good teacher, but because you have not gone through the training, you may be a bit rough, and not familiar with how to manage classes. But that's what training is supposed to do, to give you that confidence, to give you that ability. But maybe I have a very naive way of looking at teacher training. Maybe that's not what teacher training is like nowadays. The other thing I was going to say is that.
Oh, sorry, Ben Hutt.
No, I was going to say, the other thing I was going to say is that the role of Ofsted, somebody mentioned about the role of Ofsted. Maybe the role of Ofsted is not, I think somebody mentioned in Wales, they have gone away from this, high stakes accountability, and they may have inspections, but inspection is not about judging the school, but supporting the school, like giving them, okay, we found that the school has not done not done well in certain areas, maybe in supporting or safeguarding children, then giving them suggestions, giving them ideas, or supporting them in developing those areas might be a way forward, rather than condemning them, say that this is no good. I mean, we don't do that with our children. We don't say that you are a failure, you can't, you're bad. We help our children say that you can do better. This is what you should do. Maybe we should, Ofsted role could be again, I may be naive, but I think Ofsted, the role of Ofsted could be, reanalyzed. And then the other, I was going to say that accountability is sometimes not always bad. There's this interesting study in America. They found that Black teachers who are held accountable for the performance of Black children actually are more likely to stay in the school. The retention rates of these Black teachers are higher because they feel a responsibility to these Black minority pupils, and they feel that they feel that they need to stay in the school to support these children because these are pupils of the same ethnicity as them and tend to be lower performing children. So it's not always a bad thing, depending on how you look at it and how you used the accountability measures.
I think what's been really interesting about all three of those points, Benghart, is the diversity that surrounds what quality and accountability actually are. And it comes back again, doesn't it, to, is it individual level? Is it systems level? Is it even broader than that? Is it something, because people have been talking in the chat about the SDG 4 quality of teacher education or quality of education definitions as well. So is it a global perception that we need to be starting to think about? And somebody in the chat said, well, is it possible for us to start thinking about how we reclaim quality? But I think we have to ask another question. Actually, what do we mean by quality? And Larissa, you had your hand up, so I know that you wanted to come in on this.
Oh, yes, thanks so much, Tanya, and thanks, colleagues, for such a great discussion. It was just reflecting on the fact when Jo was saying that we don't, the quality conversation isn't so much, the idea of quantity is really absolutely key at the moment. And indeed, I agree with that. That's what we're seeing everywhere, that we just need more teachers, and we need them with whatever pathway we can. And there's multiple pathways that pre-service teachers can come to us. And in fact, they can almost bypass us. They can hop straight into schools and then sign up and have permission to teach. And around Australia, we see that in all states, there's a version of what we're calling permission to teach. So on the one hand, we have, a policy environment. I know we're going to talk about policy soon, Tanya, but a policy environment which is emphasising quality, and then we have practices which seem to not be focusing on that at all. One of the things to Ben Hutt's point around, how do we see improvement and how do we see it over time in some school systems in Australia? In fact, certainly the ones that I'm working with in the north of Australia, there's school improvement agendas which are not looking at, they're not calling them quality. It's not at the individual, but it's a whole school, it's a whole approach, and it's a way of seeing a kind of trajectory of a community and understanding the conditions of that community. So we see certainly at the more local level, as Jo was saying, there's different ways of understanding teaching and the systems in Australia, that different conversations are being had. But it's interesting that in those conversations, the word quality is not front and centre, but other kinds of words are there. And the last thing I just wanted to say was the notion that quality seems fixed, it's either there or it's not, is really key for us, I think, because again, I often like to think about teaching as a profession and thinking of the standards that we expect for this profession as opposed to other kinds of more generative ways of understanding other professions. So the fixedness of quality, and it's there or it's not, it's disappeared, I think is really worth us interrogating as we're thinking about this kind of issue.
And I think that could be number 2 in our panel discussion, to be honest, because it is such an important question to ask, isn't it? What is this fixed nature of quality that we have surrounding teaching and teachers as different entities, to be honest? You mentioned policy, Larissa, and I'm very conscious of time. We've only got 5 minutes left, and I'm trying to integrate some of the questions from the chat. So everybody who's attended today, thank you so much for being here. And we are looking at the chat as we're going through and trying to integrate that into our discussion. But I would like to spend a couple of minutes thinking about policy and the reforms and strategies that potentially may have worked within each of our countries to support our teacher recruitment and retention crisis, but also equally, and we've I've heard the word marketisation and privatisation today, and neoliberalism, and I know that we're very conscious about those elements of policy making relating to teacher education. So I wonder if any of my panel members today would like to make a comment, just a short comment on policy and the way in which that's impacted on teacher recruitment and retention. Perhaps Amy?
Really quickly, I guess we've already seen sort of evidence of this conversation, particularly in Australia, where we've emphasised teacher recruitment policy and supply-based responses to the crisis in recruitment and retention. There's a few reasons for this. You know, much of this discourse is stemming from the federal government in Australia, but oddly, I think as Larissa mentioned earlier, the states bear the constitutional responsibility for the education workforce. And so we see much less scrutiny, I guess, of the state-based policy responses to recruitment and retention. But we have sort of certainly solidified this supply side response, and that's bums on seats. That's whether that's through new entrants, whether that's through mid-career people entering, you know, teacher education, whether that's letting pre-service teachers start teaching earlier, but all supply side responses. We certainly haven't seen the equivalent policy responses that emphasise teacher retention or questions around teacher status. So when we, you know, the people that we talk to in our study, well, we talk about things like, you know, financial incentives, for example, that have been one policy mechanism that's been reasonably effective in, you know, recruitment and retention. It's working conditions that teachers often refer to. And so I don't think incentives work, but they certainly don't work in isolation. You know, teachers are asking for policies that support you know, protected non-teaching time. They support work-life balance or teacher workload or work intensification. They support, you know, supportive colleagues, supportive leadership. The list could go on, but they get to the, you know, they get to a heart of policies that support teachers' work, I guess, and not just the consistent supply of new teachers into the profession.
And again, these are so important in terms of understanding the range of issues relating to quality and how quality impacts on teacher recruitment and retention. What I'd like to do now, and I've let all our delegates today know that we're going to take their excellent questions and we're going to write a BIRA blog to try and answer those questions, because I don't think we can do it justice today in the time that we have left. So what I'd like to ask every panel member in one sentence: has quality killed teaching? I think I know the answers that you're going to give based on what you said today, but Claire, has quality killed teaching?
No, but accountability has.
Fabulous. Larissa?
Sorry, Tanya. No, I don't think quality has killed teaching, but it's sent it into a kind of deep sleep, really. I think that it's dulled it down. It hasn't given it the revival that it's done the opposite to what it thought it would do.
So quality has comatose teaching.
Comatose teaching. Let's go with that. The coma of teaching. Yeah.
Fabulous. Thank you. Jo?
No, I don't think quality has quite killed teaching, but I think it might have broken it a bit.
And Amy?
Yeah, I'll go with it's contributed to it, but it's comatose.
It's made it limp on. And Beng Hart?
Yes, I agree with everyone. I think it's more about accountability, holding teachers accountable for something that most of the time they have no control over. That is killing teaching.
I think your point about you wouldn't hold a doctor responsible for the death of a patient if they came in seriously and critically ill, but we do hold teachers accountable if a child comes with very challenging circumstances in their learning. So has quality killed teaching? Quality hasn't really helped teaching, but actually accountability is a huge problem. Thank you everybody for coming today. From Vicky, and I can see Sean Hayes, our new convener for the Education Effectiveness and Improvement SIG, is here too. Thank you very much for signing up, for joining us, and we hope you have a fabulous day. Take care.